So William and Catherine have officially left Windsor, and the reason why is genuinely one of the most unsettling things I've come across in a long time. Not because it's scandalous in the way royal stories usually are. There's no feud, no leaked email, no awkward balcony moment. It's unsettling because it's the kind of thing that makes you look at your own house differently at night. The story starts with a routine structural inspection at Adelaide Cottage, which is the relatively modest home on the Windsor estate, where the Prince and Princess of Wales moved specifically to give their kids something closer to a normal childhood. Engineers were doing a standard assessment of the property's foundation, the kind of thing that happens with historic buildings all the time, and what they found beneath the cottage changed everything in about 17 minutes. Beneath that quiet, charming house is a network of underground passages that predate the current structure by centuries, some of it dating back to the English Civil War. And these tunnels had somehow been completely forgotten. Not just by the family, but by every official record, every security sweep, every survey that had been conducted on the property over decades. And that's where it gets weird, because it wasn't just the tunnels themselves that triggered the alarm, it was what was inside them. Before I get into the details, if you're new here, we're Crown Watch, and we break down royal stories the way they actually happened, not the way headlines want you to think they happened. Hit subscribe so you don't miss updates as this situation develops. So here's the timeline. It's roughly at midnight on a Tuesday in late November. William and Catherine had gone to bed about 3 hours earlier. The kids, George, Charlotte, and Louis, were all asleep. The infrared sensors embedded in the walls of Adelaide Cottage picked up movement where there absolutely should not have been any. William woke up first, which tracks with his military background. Years of training programmed him to respond to the slightest disruption, and the subtle change in air pressure as security personnel started moving through the lower corridors was enough to pull him out of sleep. Catherine woke up almost immediately after, because mothers in these situations just do. Neither of them spoke. They'd learned over years of living in the public eye that in moments of potential crisis, listening tells you more than asking questions ever will. The knock on their bedroom door was soft but insistent, the kind of knock that carries urgency without creating panic. William crossed the room in 4 strides and opened the door to find Marcus Headley, their head of personal protection, standing in the dim hallway with an expression that communicated everything before words were even necessary. Behind him, 3 additional officers held positions that made it clear this was not a drill, not a false alarm, not something anyone was going to dismiss with reassurances and a return to sleep. What Headley told them was that structural engineers conducting the inspection had discovered something that transformed a quiet Tuesday evening assessment into an emergency evacuation protocol. Beneath the cottage, in spaces that hadn't been accessed or even mapped in living memory, there was evidence of recent and repeated human activity. And I don't mean like, oh, someone wandered through here 50 years ago. I mean tools that showed no rust, footprints in dust that had not yet settled, empty water bottles with purchase dates from the previous month, a folding chair that was surprisingly clean, a thermal blanket, and most disturbing of all, photographs, recent surveillance pictures of the Wales family going about their daily routines, taken from angles that suggested the photographer had intimate knowledge of their schedules, their movements, their patterns. Someone had been underneath that house while the family slept above, and not just once. This was a sustained operation. Catherine was already moving toward the children's rooms before Headley finished his briefing. That's the detail that sticks with me. She didn't wait for the full explanation. She didn't ask for clarification. The moment she understood that her children's safety was in question, she was in motion. George, Charlotte, and Louis needed to be woken gently, dressed quickly, and moved to a secure location while investigators figured out the full scope of what was happening beneath their home. And Catherine, who has spent years cultivating this image of serene capability, had that composure crack just enough in that hallway to reveal the fierce protectiveness that drives every decision she makes as a mother. William stood in the hallway watching her silhouette move from bed to bed, her voice a low murmur of reassurance, as she explained to 3 confused children that they were going on an unexpected adventure in the middle of the night. George, at 11 years old, was already beginning to understand that royal life came with complications other families never face. Charlotte, sharp and observant at 9, asked the question that cut through every carefully constructed explanation. "Are we safe here, Mommy?" And Catherine's pause, even though it lasted only a fraction of a second, was long enough for William to see the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on her shoulders. The evacuation itself moved with the practiced efficiency of a security team that trains constantly for scenarios they hope will never materialize. Louis, still foggy with sleep at 6, was carried by William down the staircase. Catherine guided the older children with a hand on each shoulder. Staff members had already packed essential items from lists that are updated quarterly and stored in secure locations throughout the property, which tells you something about the level of preparation that goes into protecting this family. 3 vehicles waited in the drive, engines running, routes already plotted and communicated to the broader security network. As they crossed the threshold into the November cold, Catherine turned for one last look at the home where they had built something precious. Adelaide Cottage had represented a deliberate choice. They'd moved there specifically to give the kids gardens to explore, rooms that felt like theirs, rather than exhibits in a museum, a version of childhood that prioritized space and freedom over the fortress-like security of Kensington Palace. Now it stood behind them in the darkness, its warm windows and familiar corners transformed into something uncertain. William's hand found hers. The motorcade pulled away at precisely 43 minutes past midnight, leaving behind a property that was already being transformed into a crime scene, an archaeological site, and a security nightmare that would require explanations to the king, the government, and eventually, in some carefully managed form, to the public. By dawn the next morning, white forensic tents had sprouted across the grounds of Adelaide Cottage, each one marking an entrance point to the underground network. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Wainwright had been pulled from her bed at midnight, called in for her expertise in historical property crimes, and her security clearance that allowed her to work within the peculiar constraints of royal investigations. What she found beneath Windsor's carefully manicured lawns challenged everything anyone thought they understood about the security of Britain's most famous royal residence. The main tunnel system extended far beyond what initial surveys had suggested. Using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging, Wainwright's team traced passages that connected Adelaide Cottage not only to Windsor Castle itself, but to 4 other properties on the estate, including Frogmore Cottage and Royal Lodge. The implications are honestly staggering when you stop and think about it. For years, potentially decades, there had existed a network of access points that bypassed every modern security measure. Every checkpoint, every carefully calibrated system designed to keep the royal family safe from threats that evolve with each passing decade. And nobody knew it was there. But the tunnels themselves, while concerning, were historical features that could be secured once their extent was fully mapped. What transformed this from an infrastructure problem into a genuine security crisis was the evidence of recent and repeated access in one chamber located directly beneath where Prince Louis's bedroom sat 20 feet above. Investigators found a small camp. Photographs, not ancient historical images, but recent surveillance pictures of the Wales family going about their daily lives. The photographs suggested someone had been watching their routines with unsettling thoroughness. School drop-off times, Catherine's morning runs through the estate, the hours when security presence was at its lowest due to shift changes. This wasn't casual observation. This was methodical. William received updates hourly throughout that first day. Each briefing added new layers to an increasingly disturbing picture. He and Catherine had taken the children to a secure location at Kensington Palace. And the irony was not lost on either of them that they had moved to Windsor specifically to give their children more freedom, more space, more of the childhood normalcy they both valued so deeply. Now they sat in the apartment that had once been their primary residence, explaining to 3 pairs of questioning eyes why they could not yet return home. The investigation moved with the speed that royal security concerns demand, but also with the caution that historical significance requires. Every item found in the tunnels had to be documented, photographed, and analyzed, not only for security implications, but for potential historical value. Dr. Helena Ashworth from the Royal Collection Trust found herself working alongside counterterrorism specialists, her expertise in Tudor and Stuart-era architecture suddenly critical to understanding how these passages had remained hidden from modern surveys and security sweeps for so long. By mid-afternoon, a partial picture had emerged. The tunnel network was far older than Adelaide Cottage itself, dating to at least the 1600s, possibly earlier. Some passages showed evidence of use during World War II when Windsor Castle had been fortified against potential German invasion, and the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret had sheltered there throughout the Blitz. But somewhere in the decades since, knowledge of the full extent of these tunnels had been lost. It survived perhaps in fragmentary documents that had been misfiled, ignored, or simply forgotten in the vast archives of royal properties. The question that haunted every investigator, every security officer, every official who received briefings throughout that long day was the same question Catherine had asked in the darkness of Adelaide Cottage's hallway. Who had rediscovered these tunnels, and what did they intend by gaining such intimate access to the future king's family? King Charles received his briefing at Clarence House, and his reaction, while carefully controlled in front of staff, was conveyed with crystal clarity in the phone call he made to William shortly thereafter. The king has lived through decades of security scares, intruders in bedrooms, suspicious packages, credible threats that required constant vigilance, but this felt different, more insidious, because it represented a failure of the very ground beneath their feet to provide the security that everyone had assumed was absolute. By evening, the investigation had expanded to include MI5, whose expertise in counterintelligence and threat assessment provided resources beyond what even the most sophisticated royal protection team could muster. Agents began the painstaking process of reviewing security footage from the past 6 months, looking for patterns, for faces that appeared too frequently, for vehicles that lingered too long in areas with sightlines to Adelaide Cottage. The Digital Forensics Unit began analyzing the photographs found underground, extracting metadata, identifying the camera equipment used, building a profile of someone who had invested significant time and resources into watching the Wales family. Catherine spent that day attempting to maintain normalcy for the children, but George's questions had become increasingly pointed as the day wore on. He understood enough about security protocols to know that this was not a routine evacuation, not a simple maintenance issue that would be resolved with a few repairs and a return home by week's end. William found his eldest son standing at a window overlooking Kensington Gardens, his young shoulders squared in a posture that reminded the prince painfully of himself at that age, already learning that being royal meant living with threats that other children never had to contemplate. The conversation between father and son was brief but honest, calibrated to provide truth without inducing fear, to acknowledge reality without overwhelming a child who was still finding his footing in a life he had not chosen. William had promised himself years ago that he would not replicate the emotional distance of his own upbringing, that his children would know they could come to him with questions, with fears, with the messy complications of growing up under unprecedented scrutiny. Now that commitment was being tested by circumstances that required a delicate balance between transparency and protection. As night fell over London, the investigation at Windsor continued under portable lighting that cast strange shadows across the formerly peaceful grounds. The work would go on through the night and into the days that followed, each hour revealing new complications, new questions, new reasons why returning to their home was not a decision that could be made quickly or lightly. The morning briefing on day 3 brought revelations that shifted the investigation from security concern into something that touched on questions of historical conspiracy and modern obsession. Among the items recovered from the tunnels were documents carefully preserved in waterproof containers that suggested the person accessing these spaces had been engaged in research that went far beyond simple surveillance. Maps dating to different eras had been marked with annotations, cross-references, and theories that spoke to someone pursuing a quest that blended history with dangerous fantasy. Professor James Harrington, a historian specializing in royal properties and their secret architecture, was brought in to examine the documents and provide context. What he found disturbed him in ways that academic study rarely achieves. The maps and notes suggested that someone had become obsessed with the idea of hidden treasures allegedly concealed by royals during times of political upheaval. References to the English Civil War appeared frequently, along with speculation about jewels and gold that might have been hidden in tunnels beneath Windsor to prevent them from falling into parliamentary hands. This was not scholarly research. This was the work of someone who had allowed historical interest to curdle into obsession, someone willing to violate every boundary of law and safety to pursue theories that existed only in the darker corners of internet forums and conspiracy literature. William sat across from Detective Chief Inspector Wainwright as she walked him through the emerging profile. The intruder, for that was now the clear designation, appeared to be someone with extensive knowledge of historical texts, access to resources that allowed them to acquire ground-penetrating radar equipment, and the patience to conduct surveillance and underground exploration over an extended period. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence suggesting this had been going on far longer than the recent months indicated by the dates on water bottles and equipment. Deeper in the tunnel system, in chambers that required crawling through spaces barely wide enough for an adult body, investigators found older camps, items dating back nearly 2 years. journals filled with observations written in a cramped hand that became increasingly difficult to decipher, as if the writer had been descending into a mental state that matched the physical descent into the earth beneath Windsor. Catherine's response to each new briefing was the controlled fury of a mother whose primary instinct to protect her children had been violated in the most invasive way imaginable. She had accepted the loss of privacy that came with her role. The cameras that follow her every public appearance, the commentary on everything from her fashion choices to her parenting decisions, but this was fundamentally different. This was someone who had been underneath their home while her children slept above, someone who had watched and waited and planned something that remained unclear but felt malevolent in its patient execution. The decision about when, or even if, they could return to Adelaide Cottage now involved considerations that extended far beyond simply securing the tunnel entrances. Every room would need to be swept for surveillance equipment. The entire property would require a security upgrade that would effectively transform their home into something much closer to a fortress. And the very quality that had made Adelaide Cottage attractive, its relative modesty and accessibility within the Windsor estate, had become its fatal flaw in an age where security threats could come from beneath as easily as from beyond the gates. King Charles convened a meeting at Buckingham Palace that brought together security chiefs, government officials, and senior members of the royal household. The conversation was frank in a way that royal meetings rarely achieve, driven by the recognition that this incident had exposed vulnerabilities extending far beyond a single property. If tunnels beneath Windsor had been forgotten and exploited, what other historical features of royal properties might represent similar risks? The Tower of London with its medieval foundations, Hampton Court Palace with its Tudor-era secrets, even Buckingham Palace itself, which had been built and rebuilt over centuries, incorporating structures and passages that might not appear in any modern survey. The discussion turned to questions of public disclosure, an issue that always complicates royal security matters. The press had already begun noticing that the Wales family had not been seen at Adelaide Cottage for several days, that their routines had been disrupted, that something unusual was occurring at Windsor. Managing the narrative would require careful consideration of how much truth could be shared without compromising the ongoing investigation or providing a roadmap for others who might be inspired by this intrusion. William and Catherine sat together that evening in Kensington Palace, the children finally asleep after a day spent trying to maintain educational routines and normal activities in decidedly abnormal circumstances. The conversation between husband and wife touched on questions they had been avoiding, considerations about whether their desire to give their children a more grounded upbringing had inadvertently exposed them to risks that tighter security at more traditional royal residences would have prevented. There was no blame in the discussion, only the shared recognition that every decision about how to raise their family came with trade-offs that sometimes revealed themselves in painful ways. The investigation had identified a suspect by this point, though the individual had not yet been located. Security footage analysis had revealed a pattern of a single man, estimated to be in his late 40s, who had been observed in areas near Adelaide Cottage with sufficient frequency to warrant deeper investigation. His vehicle had been tracked to a property 3 miles from Windsor, but when officers arrived to question him, they found a rented cottage abandoned in haste, with evidence suggesting he had learned somehow that his underground access had been discovered and that he needed to disappear quickly. The manhunt that followed involved resources typically reserved for counterterrorism operations. This individual had demonstrated knowledge of royal properties, access to surveillance equipment, and a willingness to spend years pursuing whatever goal had driven him into those tunnels. Whether that goal was theft, harm, or something else entirely remained unclear, but the uncertainty itself was threatening enough to demand the full attention of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The breakthrough in identifying him came not from forensic evidence or surveillance footage, but from a source that highlighted how thoroughly the internet has transformed the landscape of royal obsession. A moderator of an online forum dedicated to royal history flagged a series of posts that had been growing increasingly concerning over the past 18 months. The user, posting under the pseudonym Windsor Truth Seeker, had been sharing detailed theories about hidden treasures beneath royal properties, complete with maps that bore striking similarities to the annotated documents found in the tunnels beneath Adelaide Cottage. Dr. Miranda Foster, a psychologist specializing in obsessive behaviors and parasocial relationships with public figures, was brought in to analyze the digital footprint. What she found painted a picture of someone whose interest in royal history had metastasized into something far more troubling. The post showed a progression from academic curiosity to conspiracy thinking to personal grievance, with the writer eventually expressing belief that he had been chosen to uncover truths that the royal family was deliberately hiding from the British public. The language suggested someone who had constructed an entire narrative in which he was the protagonist of a historical drama, justified in his intrusions because he was serving a higher purpose. The real identity emerged through painstaking digital investigation. Malcolm Hendricks, 47 years old, formerly a museum curator at a minor historical society in Kent, dismissed 3 years earlier for behavior that colleagues had described as increasingly erratic and obsessive. After his termination, Hendricks had apparently devoted himself full-time to researching royal properties, using his still considerable expertise in historical architecture and his knowledge of archival research to pursue theories that existed nowhere except in his increasingly isolated mind. What made Hendricks particularly dangerous was the combination of genuine expertise with deteriorating judgment. He knew how to read historical documents, he knew how to interpret architectural plans, he knew how to conduct research in archives without drawing attention. But somewhere in his isolated pursuit, he had crossed from scholarship into delusion, convincing himself that the Wales family was somehow blocking his access to historical discoveries that would make his reputation and prove that his dismissal from the museum had been unjust persecution. The journals found in the deepest parts of the tunnel system, when finally transcribed and analyzed, revealed a mind that had been spending increasing amounts of time underground, sometimes for stretches of 8 or 10 hours. Hendricks had written about feeling more comfortable in the tunnels than in the surface world, about how the darkness and silence allowed him to think clearly about how close he felt to the history he was uncovering. The entries about the Wales family began as simple observations, but evolved into something more personal, with Hendricks apparently constructing parasocial relationships with family members he had only ever observed from a distance or through the lens of his camera. William received the psychological assessment with the grim recognition that this was a threat that could not be resolved simply by improving physical security. Hendricks remained at large, his current location unknown, despite a nationwide alert to law enforcement agencies. The profile suggested that he would likely not abandon his obsession simply because his access to the tunnels had been discovered. Someone who had invested years in pursuit of his theories, who had violated every boundary of law and privacy, who had constructed an entire identity around his underground explorations, that person was not going to simply walk away and return to normal life. Catherine found herself dealing with questions from George that she struggled to answer honestly while still maintaining his sense of security. Her eldest son had overheard enough fragments of adult conversations to understand that someone had been watching their family, that this person had been underneath their home, that he remained unaccounted for. The conversation she eventually had with George was one of the most difficult of her years as a mother, balancing the need to acknowledge real danger with the equally important need to prevent fear from dominating his childhood. The security upgrades at Adelaide Cottage proceeded with efficiency that transformed the property week by week. The tunnel entrances were not simply sealed, but retrofitted with sensors that would detect any attempted access. The grounds received additional surveillance cameras, facial recognition systems, and monitoring equipment that would make future intrusions significantly more difficult. But each improvement, necessary as it was, represented another step away from the relative normalcy that had made Adelaide Cottage appealing in the first place. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded to examine whether Hendricks had been working alone or was part of a broader network of royal obsessives who shared information and perhaps even coordinated activities. The online forums where he had been active revealed a subculture that most people never encounter, a digital underground where conspiracy theories about the royal family flourish and where individuals encourage each other toward increasingly boundary-violating behavior in pursuit of truth that exists only in their shared delusions. The psychological toll on the Wales family manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Louis had nightmares about monsters in the ground, his 6-year-old mind processing the disruption through fears that required patient reassurance night after night. Charlotte became hyper-vigilant about locked doors and closed windows, checking and rechecking security measures with a thoroughness that broke Catherine's heart. George withdrew into quiet observation, watching his parents' faces for signs of worry that they tried unsuccessfully to hide. By the third week, a grim reality had settled over the family's situation. Even if Hendricks were apprehended, even if the tunnels were completely secured, even if every possible security measure were implemented, Adelaide Cottage had been transformed in their minds from a home into a place where someone had violated their most basic sense of safety. The cottage itself had done nothing wrong. The walls and rooms remained as charming and comfortable as they had been before that midnight alarm, but the knowledge of what had been happening beneath them, of the watching and waiting and planning that had occurred while they slept unsuspecting above, had poisoned something essential about the space. William and Catherine began having conversations about alternatives, discussions that felt like admissions of defeat, but which both recognized as necessary. Perhaps a different property on the Windsor estate, one without the historical baggage of forgotten tunnels and someone else's obsessive violation. Perhaps a return to Kensington Palace full-time, accepting the trade-off of less privacy and space in exchange for the layered security that came with a property continuously occupied and monitored for generations. Perhaps something else entirely, a solution that had not yet revealed itself, but which might allow them to rebuild the sense of home that Hendricks had taken from them. The decision, when it finally came, was presented not as a defeat, but as a strategic choice, based on comprehensive security assessments. But both William and Catherine understood the truth beneath the official language. They were being forced to leave their home, not by direct threat or immediate danger, but by the poisonous knowledge that their sanctuary had been compromised in ways that could not be completely undone. The morning they officially departed Adelaide Cottage arrived with a kind of gray November rain that seems designed to match somber moods. The announcement would be made to the press later that day, carefully worded to provide enough truth to satisfy curiosity while withholding details that might compromise ongoing security investigations or inspire others with similar obsessions. The Wales family was relocating their primary residence to allow for comprehensive infrastructure and security upgrades at Adelaide Cottage, a process expected to take several months at minimum, possibly longer depending on the scope of work required. The children had been prepared over the preceding days through age-appropriate conversations that balanced honesty with reassurance. George understood the most, asking questions about the investigation that revealed his emerging grasp of the complicated reality of their lives. Charlotte had made peace with the move more quickly, her resilience and adaptability already showing the strength of character that would serve her well in years to come. Louis, still young enough to accept change with relative ease if his parents remained steady presences, was already asking about which toys would come to their new home and whether there would be gardens to explore. Catherine walked through Adelaide Cottage one final time, alone except for the ever-present security detail that maintained respectful distance. Each room held memories accumulated over the years they had lived there. The kitchen, where she had attempted elaborate birthday cakes and simpler weeknight dinners, finding joy in the domestic routines that connected her to mothers everywhere. The sitting room, where family movie nights had become cherished traditions. The bedrooms, where her children had grown from babies to young people with distinct personalities and emerging independence. The violation that had forced their departure had not erased those memories, but it had tainted them with knowledge she could not unknow. William spent his final walkthrough cataloging not just emotional attachment, but also practical reality. The security upgrades that would be implemented were comprehensive and necessary, but they would also fundamentally change the character of the property. Adelaide Cottage would become more secure, but it would also become more like every other royal residence, wrapped in layers of technology and protocol that created safety at the cost of the casual comfort they had treasured. Whether they would ever truly want to return, even after months of reconstruction and security enhancement, remained an open question that neither he nor Catherine had fully confronted. The move itself was conducted with military precision, staff and security coordinating to transport the family's belongings to their new accommodation with minimal disruption to the children's routines. They were returning to Kensington Palace, at least temporarily, while longer-term decisions about their living arrangements could be made with careful consideration rather than emergency haste. The apartment there was familiar, having served as their London base throughout their years at Adelaide Cottage, but it would now need to function as their primary home, a shift that required both practical adjustments and emotional recalibration. King Charles visited them on their third evening back at Kensington, a private dinner that allowed for conversations about family and security, and the burden of trying to maintain any sense of normalcy while living under the constant weight of public attention and potential threat. The king spoke from experience, having navigated decades of security concerns and adjusted his own life repeatedly to accommodate the reality that being royal meant accepting restrictions that most people would find intolerable. But he also acknowledged that each generation faced its own specific challenges, and that what William and Catherine were dealing with represented a modern evolution of old threats. The investigation into Malcolm Hendricks continued with intensity, but frustratingly limited progress. Despite the nationwide alert and public appeals for information, he seemed to have vanished with the thoroughness of someone who had been planning for the possibility of discovery. His rented cottage had been forensically examined, revealing evidence of extensive research into royal properties beyond Windsor, including detailed maps of Sandringham and Balmoral, that suggested he had been contemplating expanding his underground explorations to other royal estates. The psychological assessment had been updated to reflect growing concern that Hendrix's isolation and obsession might lead him to escalate beyond surveillance into more direct and dangerous action. The impact on the children revealed itself gradually over the weeks that followed their departure. George became more serious, asking questions about security protocols with an intensity that suggested he was beginning to understand that his future would involve constant vigilance and restricted freedom. Charlotte experienced anxiety that manifested in reluctance to sleep alone, requiring Catherine's presence until she drifted off each night. Louis seemed to adjust most easily, his young mind able to accept the new normal without dwelling on the reasons behind it, though he occasionally asked when they would go back to our real house, a question that neither parent could answer with certainty. Catherine found herself grieving not just the loss of their home, but the loss of a vision for how they would raise their children. Adelaide Cottage had represented a deliberate choice to prioritize family life over royal convenience, to give George, Charlotte, and Louis as much space and freedom as their circumstances would allow. That choice had now been revealed as perhaps naive, a well-intentioned attempt to normalize lives that were fundamentally abnormal and always would be. The guilt she felt was irrational but persistent. The nagging question of whether her desire to give her children a certain kind of childhood had inadvertently exposed them to risks that could have been avoided with more traditional royal housing arrangements. William struggled with his own version of the same guilt, compounded by the recognition that his position as future king made his family perpetual targets for obsession, grievance, and threats, both credible and fantastic. He had tried to create a life that balanced duty with fatherhood, public service with private joy, the weight of history with the lightness that childhood should possess. The incident at Adelaide Cottage felt like a judgment on those efforts, a reminder that the bargain he had been born into allowed no true escape from scrutiny and danger. By late December, a fragile new normal had been established at Kensington Palace. The children were settling into adjusted routines, their schools informed of security updates, but otherwise proceeding with education that aimed for as much regularity as possible. William and Catherine had resumed public duties, their faces showing the practiced serenity that years of royal training had instilled, while privately they continued working through decisions about their long-term living situation. Adelaide Cottage sat empty on the Windsor estate, undergoing renovations that were technically about infrastructure, but which everyone involved understood were really about trying to restore a sense of safety to a space that had been irrevocably compromised. The question of whether they would ever return hung unanswered in the air between them, spoken about only in the most oblique terms. The cottage could be secured, the tunnels could be sealed, every possible technical measure could be implemented. But the psychological barrier, the knowledge of what had happened there, of who had been watching and waiting beneath their floors, of how thoroughly their sanctuary had been violated, might prove impossible to overcome. Some wounds to the sense of home and safety do not heal simply because time passes and physical repairs are made. On Christmas Eve, with their children asleep and the palace quiet around them, William and Catherine stood together looking out over Kensington Gardens, talking in the hushed tones of parents who have learned to snatch private conversations in the margins of busy lives. They spoke about the year ending, about challenges faced and adjustments made, about their hopes for the children and their concerns about the future. Neither said aloud what both were thinking, that Adelaide Cottage might remain forever in their past, rather than returning to their future. A casualty not of any specific threat, but of the corrosive knowledge that their home had been anything but safe while they had believed themselves protected by stone and tradition, and the simple assumption that royal security was absolute. That's the thing about feeling safe. It's not really about walls or sensors or security protocols. It's about belief. And once that belief is broken, once you know someone was there in the dark beneath your floors while your children slept, no amount of renovation can fully rebuild it.